Have you ever wondered what it truly feels like to step into the heart of the Ministry of Magic on a day that feels like the world itself is holding its breath? You trudge through the gleaming marble corridors, the air perfumed faintly with polish and old parchment, and it presses against your skin like invisible hands, reminding you of every petty injustice that has ever occurred within these walls. Sunlight glints off brass door handles and enchanted plaques, and somewhere above, a series of portraits murmur to one another, eyes flicking suspiciously at your presence, judging your curiosity, or perhaps just marveling at your mortal endurance. You probably won't survive a full day here without noticing the oddity of this place. How a simple scratch of a quill can summon a cascade of magical sparks, or how an enchanted cup of tea will refold itself into the exact shape your hand demands. As if the ministry itself has a sly sense of humor. You hear whispers echoing along the corridors, rumors of disciplinary overreach, of pink-skirted tyranny, of a woman whose very smile is calculated to unsettle. But it's not just hearsay. The air vibrates with collective memory, a subtle hum that tickles your spine and whispers warnings you're only half ready to heed. In the distance, the rhythmic tapping of polished shoes announces the approach of the accused. Dolores Umbridge, perfectly poised, her pink cardigan radiating an almost comically deceptive warmth that belies the sharpness of her intentions. You notice how her cat-shaped brooch glimmers with a faint magical pulse, a small, eerie reminder that even in whimsy, there can be cruelty. You imagine the countless decrees she has written, the papers stacked neatly like soldiers, and the magical quills that may still remember the sting of inked punishments. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. You feel a twinge of disbelief at the absurdity of it all, a tension between the comedic and the terrifying, and your mind dances over the question, can anyone truly be judged fairly in a place so steeped in memory and magic? I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take a deep breath, letting the ministry's cold, polished air mingle with the warmth of your anticipation, ready for a trial that promises to be as unnerving as it is illuminating, a spectacle where every glance, every whispered word, and every subtle flicker of magic carries weight. The room shifts subtly as Umbridge glides in, her shoes clicking against the polished floor in a rhythm that feels almost like a countdown to chaos, and you can't help but notice the absurdity of her appearance. Pink cardigan perfectly pressed, hair in its usual precise bun, the faint scent of elderberry perfume wafting like a warning. Her eyes sweep the chamber with practiced indifference, yet you sense the tension tightening around her, a living thing that curls like smoke beneath the high ceilings, brushing against the enchanted chandeliers that cast shifting shadows on the walls. You feel a shiver run down your spine, partly from the draft, partly from the surreal mixture of whimsy and menace. And you are acutely aware that in this room, magic serves as much as a mirror as a weapon. The air carries whispers of past transgressions, the decrees she wrote, the punishments she administered, and the odd, almost comical love of office cats who might be hiding tiny enchantments in their tails. You can't help but smirk slightly at the thought, realizing that even in cruelty, there is ritualistic absurdity, like a joke only the ministry fully understands. And yet, this is serious. History is breathing down her neck, and the papers on the desks, neatly stacked and magically preserved, seem to lean forward slightly, as if eager to testify. You feel the weight of every eyewitness account that will come later, and the magical artifacts that will animate to reveal inconvenient truths, and you realize that the spectacle you are about to witness is one of morality as much as legality. Your senses heighten. The faint clink of quills, the rustle of robes, the soft hum of protective charms you can't see, all combining into a tapestry that is both mesmerizing and unsettling. The ministry, ever the arbiter of subtle terror and rigid decorum, seems to lean in closer, holding its collective breath, waiting to see if even the most meticulously calculated defenses can withstand the unyielding force of scrutiny. You feel a peculiar thrill at being a part of this, an almost guilty enjoyment at the tension, and yet you understand that history and magic entwine here in ways that leave no room for certainty, that even the smallest gesture, a flick of a finger, a twitch of a smile, can ripple through the room with consequences far beyond what the eye can see. The trial begins with a delicate, almost theatrical clearing of throats, and you notice immediately how the atmosphere seems to shimmer with both anticipation and a strange, prickling anxiety, as if the very walls of the ministry remember every injustice ever committed within their polished confines. You trudge to your seat near the back, the floor beneath you cool and smooth, carrying a faint scent of parchment, dust, and faintly acrid ink. And you can't help but glance around at the assembly, witches and wizards of varying rank, robes in somber hues, faces taut with curiosity, suspicion, or mild dread. The prosecution steps forward, a pair of seasoned ministry lawyers who speak with quiet authority, their voices carrying effortlessly, barely disturbed by the occasional fluttering portrait or shifting chandelier above. They begin to lay out the charges. Tyrannical enforcement of draconian school decrees, abuse of power under the guise of educational reform, and a litany of remembered injustices that ripple through the wizarding community even years later. You notice the subtle magical enhancements, tiny sparks of levitation to highlight documents, faintly glowing quills hovering over parchment as evidence is read aloud, each one a reminder that in this world, the line between mundane procedure and spectacle is blurred. Witnesses shuffle nervously, some clutching their robes, others whispering spells under their breath for courage, and you feel a mixture of empathy and fascination. One by one, the testimonies unfold, each tinged with vivid recollections, the sting of Umbridge's cruel ink, the unsettling precision of her rule, the small, almost absurd rituals she performed to maintain control, such as requiring pink parchment for all official notes or mandating that her tiny cat figurines be present at all formal meetings, a quirk both whimsical and menacing. You catch yourself smiling at the ridiculousness even as a shiver travels your spine. This is justice, yes, but performed in a world where magic can make the invisible palpable, where a quill can remember more than a witness, and where every gesture is magnified by enchantments you can barely comprehend. A fringe historian in you wonders about the ethics of magical documentation. If a quill can remember cruelty, does it also carry guilt? And could this be debated endlessly among scholars? Meanwhile, a faint rustle announces another piece of enchanted evidence. A stack of meticulously annotated memos levitates, spinning slowly in the air like an eerie carousel of bureaucratic torment, highlighting both the meticulousness of her power and the absurdity of her obsessive formality. As you watch, you realize that this trial is not merely about punishment, but about memory, spectacle, and the subtle theater of authority. Even now, the room feels alive, humming with the tension between justice and the performative weight of magic. Witness accounts begin to pour in, and you feel the room grow heavier with each confession of small torments and absurd strictures, like invisible ink darkening the air around you. Each story a thread in a tapestry of Umbridge's meticulously maintained reign of discomfort. You lean forward as a former Hogwarts student recounts how even the walls seem to conspire with her, enchanted to amplify the sound of every reprimand, every pen stroke against parchment, a seemingly trivial punishment that somehow seared itself into memory, leaving an almost tactile echo in the mind. Another voice rises, this one belonging to a teacher long retired who remembers how Umbridge's obsession with pink fabric and matching office decor could not mask the sharp sting of her edicts. The magical creatures she adored, the cats, the enchanted kittens, were sometimes enlisted as subtle instruments of intimidation, their tiny charms catching unsuspecting students in harmless yet unnerving ways. You notice how the courtroom itself seems to respond. Quills hovering mid-air, enchanted ink swirling lazily in spirals, capturing the nuance of each recollection, as if eager to immortalize every subtle detail. Some testimonies bring humor to the tension. A student once had to write lines on invisible parchment while standing on a stack of chairs, a spell gone wrong causing the words to float chaotically, which elicited a faint, reluctant chuckle even from the more stern officials. You can't help but imagine how ridiculous it must have looked, a surreal ballet of punishment and magical mischief. Yet there is an undercurrent of gravity beneath the levity, the sheer weight of remembered fear, of creativity suppressed under the guise of discipline, and you realize that the trial balances precariously between whimsy and horror, like a potion teetering on the edge of a cauldron. A fringe tidbit emerges as a witness recalls that Umbridge allegedly enchanted certain inkwells to report misbehavior directly to her, a claim debated endlessly in some scholarly circles, though unverified. You feel the delicious tension of ambiguity, the sense that history is as much about memory as it is about fact, and you watch the interplay of magical testimony and human recollection with fascination. The more you listen, the more the room seems to hum, a subtle vibration in the floor and walls, as if the ministry itself is attuned to the stories being told, acknowledging the absurdity, the cruelty, and the small acts of resilience woven through each account. You catch glimpses of the accused, sitting stiffly, her expression a mask of feigned serenity, yet you sense the micro-tremors of discomfort, the slight twitch of a finger, the tightening of a jaw, the imperceptible flinch as a quill hovers a bit too close, bearing silent witness to the tales being recounted. The juxtaposition of the theatrical and the solemn, the magical and the mundane, leaves you on edge, a participant and observer in equal measure, aware that each word spoken here carries resonance far beyond the chamber, whispering into corridors, memories, and the quiet spaces of Hogwarts itself, shaping perception in ways that will ripple outward long after the trial has concluded. The magical evidence is unveiled with a flourish that makes your pulse quicken, as if the ministry itself delights in theatrics while demanding solemn attention. Parchment lifts from desks of its own accord, swirling in lazy arcs before settling in midair, the ink shimmering as though eager to speak its long-held truths. You notice how quills hover near each document, tiny sparks of enchanted light tracing the sentences, emphasizing particularly damning passages, and you can almost hear the sighs of relief or dismay from the witnesses, who recognize their own words now animated in ways both fascinating and unnerving. Contracts she authored, memos she issued, and reports she signed all materialized like ghostly reenactments of bureaucracy, their magical essence flickering in soft golds and silvers, illuminating the chamber in a glow that feels both ethereal and judgmental. You find yourself leaning in closer as a memorandum describing the insistence on uniformity in lesson plans floats past, and a quill obediently underlines the text, almost smirking in its tiny magical way, highlighting phrases like unapproved imagination and excessive creativity with deliberate emphasis. It's both absurd and terrifying. A mundane act, paperwork, is elevated to a spectacle of moral reckoning, and you feel your chest tighten with the realization that magic can make every tiny infraction monumentally significant. There's humor too, subtle and dry. A cat-shaped paperweight she once used hovers and rolls across the floor, causing a minor distraction, and you catch yourself stifling a laugh at the incongruity of such a menacing figure associated with feline whimsy. Yet beneath the levity, the evidence is damning. You see spellwork that manipulated parchment to record infractions, enchanted quills that would self-report mistakes, and even ink that seemed to etch reminders of past punishments onto the desks of innocent students, a combination of bureaucracy and magical cruelty that lingers in memory long after the paper is gone. A fringe tidbit comes to light when an archivist explains that some documents bear subtle charms believed to protect their contents from falsification, though scholars debate whether such enchantments were ever legally binding or merely psychological intimidation, and you feel the thrill of historical ambiguity as the magical and mundane collide in an intricate dance of ethics and spectacle. The prosecution moves seamlessly between reading aloud and letting the evidence act, the documents performing subtle demonstrations, ink lifting into the air to form miniature reenactments, small curses harmlessly bouncing in midair, faint glows tracing punitive actions with eerie precision. and you can't help but marvel at the skill required to choreograph such a display without the proceedings descending into chaos. Your senses sharpen, the soft hum of protective charms, the scent of parchment infused with long-dried ink, the occasional faint jingle of feline figurines magically shifting positions, all converge to create an atmosphere both mesmerizing and unsettling. You notice a slight quiver in the accused's composure as an enchanted memo recounts a particularly notorious incident, her lips pressing into a thin line as she adjusts the pink cuffs of her cardigan, the gesture a microcosm of control and panic intertwined. The room is alive with magic and memory, each document a tiny actor in the courtroom drama, demonstrating not just what occurred, but how power was exercised in subtle, sometimes bizarre ways, leaving the observers, yourself included, caught between amusement, horror, and fascination. By the time the final memo floats back onto the desk, perfectly aligned and glowing faintly, you realize that this is more than a trial. It's a confrontation between the tangible past and the lingering echoes of magical bureaucracy, an intricate ballet of evidence, memory, and the unsettling awareness that even in a world of spells and enchantments, consequences are as inescapable as the very air you breathe. Each levitating quill, each animated page, and each flicker of enchanted ink reinforces the duality of Umbridge's tenure. Absurdly meticulous, yet terrifyingly oppressive, whimsical, yet devastatingly effective, leaving you pondering how the mundane and the magical entwine to preserve memory, shape perception, and, perhaps, deliver a form of justice uniquely suited to a world where every action can be recorded and observed in perpetuity. The defense begins its efforts with a precision that feels almost surgical, and you can't help but watch, fascinated, as Umbridge's words slip from her lips like honey laced with venom, polite and measured, yet designed to distract, to charm, and perhaps even to intimidate all at once. She speaks of duty, of adherence to rules, of the necessity of order, and you notice the faint quiver in her voice when she addresses the more damning points. A subtle crack in the armor of pink and prim perfection she wears so deliberately. Her gestures are impeccable, hand movements small and controlled, a carefully choreographed display of authority, while tiny protective charms flicker around her, almost imperceptible, deflecting the more probing magical probes the prosecution attempts. You lean in as a subtle ripple of energy dances around the enchanted quills on the desks, tiny sparks diverting from the documents toward her protective wards. A duel of magic played silently in the air, hinting that her meticulousness extends beyond paperwork into self-preservation spells that scholars debate endlessly. Are these defensive measures legitimate protective magic or an insidious attempt to manipulate the court? You catch glimpses of her strategy, references to precedent, to laws buried deep in the Ministry archives, to obscure regulations that on paper seem reasonable, but in practice allowed her to enact policies that were oppressive. And you can feel the weight of the tension in the room as every subtle intonation, every measured pause, is calculated to reinforce her image of competence and control. Some of her methods are almost comical, if you don't think too hard about the consequences. She produces an enchanted clipboard that hovers beside her, rotating slowly, projecting a holographic display of attendance records and disciplinary logs. The floating documents shimmer in soft gold and green light, highlighting her diligence. Yet you can't help noticing the absurdity of it, a magical PowerPoint in a world where pens often exact revenge. You feel the quiet amusement bubble up even as the seriousness of the trial presses on. It's hard not to marvel at the theater of it, where the mundane and the magical entwine to shape perception and sway judgment. The defense calls a few witnesses, carefully selected staff members and minor ministry officials, whose testimonies range from understated praise for her diligence to more questionable accounts of rigid enforcement framed as efficiency. You notice the subtle cues in the witnesses' eyes and gestures, small magical signals betraying discomfort or reluctance, each one a microcosm of how power and fear intermingle in the wizarding world. A fringe historian might note that Umbridge's charms and tricks echo tactics documented in obscure magical treatises from the early 19th century, though scholars debate whether such techniques were ever widely practiced or effective outside anecdotal accounts, and you feel the tension of historical ambiguity hovering in the room like an invisible fog. Meanwhile, you watch the enchanted quills and memos continue their quiet rebellion, flickering with residual energy as if reminding the court that magic remembers more than words, that actions echo beyond the spoken testimony, and that the spectacle is far from neutral. Humor finds its way in brief, almost imperceptible moments. A tiny animated cat figurine, enchanted long ago to perch on her desk, scampers past a witness's feet, prompting a suppressed chuckle that ripples through the tense audience. It's absurd, and yet a reminder that even in the darkest bureaucracy, whimsy can survive, quietly, stubbornly. As the defense weaves its narrative, you feel the courtroom itself respond, the enchanted parchment pulsing faintly, the portraits in the walls murmuring softly, all observers to a carefully orchestrated dance of rhetoric and magic. You are acutely aware that every word, every gesture, every subtle enchantment serves dual purposes, to defend, to impress, and to manipulate, and you realize that the trial is as much an exercise in perception and theatricality as in law and morality. Even now you sense the unspoken question lingering. Can technical skill, charm, and defensive magic ever absolve the weight of remembered cruelty, or does history, in its quiet omniscience, have the final say? In this moment, you are caught between fascination, horror, and amusement, witnessing the interplay of intellect, power, and magical nuance, and understanding that this trial, like many moments in wizarding history, is never truly about absolutes, but about the delicate balance of evidence, persuasion, and the subtle whisper of moral memory that hovers invisibly in the air. Just when you think the trial is settling into a predictable rhythm, a twist shatters the carefully maintained balance, and you feel a ripple of astonishment pass through the room as a witness you didn't expect steps forward, their robes slightly disheveled, eyes wide with a mix of fear and resolve, ready to recount a story that has lain dormant in the shadows of memory. You notice immediately that this is not an ordinary testimony. It blends humor with profound revelation, a combination that leaves the courtroom leaning forward, collectively holding its breath. The witness begins describing a peculiar incident at Hogwarts during Umbridge's tenure, a routine inspection that devolved into absurdity when enchanted quills went rogue, scrawling nonsensical sentences on students' robes, quivering like tiny angry serpents, leaving trails of magical ink that shimmered in shifting colors, and creating a scene so chaotic that even the sternest professors struggled to maintain composure. You can almost see it unfolding, the students' muffled laughter, the frantic scrambling of the caretaker trying to contain the misbehaving quills, the flick of Umbridge's wand as she attempted in vain to assert control over the enchanted pandemonium. Yet beneath the comedy lies a stark reality. The incident exposes the fragile veneer of her authority and demonstrates how even small magical miscalculations could amplify fear, embarrassment, and punishment, a subtle yet potent reminder that power in the wizarding world is never absolute. The courtroom responds in kind. Enchanted quills suspended mid-air emit tiny sparks as if winking at the absurdity, and a portrait of a long-dead Hogwarts headmaster leans forward to mutter a bemused comment about the inefficiency of overzealous oversight. You find yourself smiling at the chaotic scene, yet you are also unsettled by the undercurrent of oppression that runs through it, the cruel enjoyment derived from rigid enforcement of rules that could have been arbitrary, and the lingering question of whether magic, when wielded without empathy, amplifies the inherent risks of bureaucracy. As the witness continues, they reveal a previously hidden facet of Umbridge's personality, a meticulous, almost obsessive fascination with control that manifested in minor, absurd rituals, like requiring that every classroom use a specific shade of pink for chalk dust collection, or enforcing a meticulous alignment of student robes before lessons, details that seem trivial yet collectively suffocate spontaneity and morale. You can sense the tension rising in the room. Every small story of whimsical cruelty now forms a lattice of evidence, delicate yet compelling, against a backdrop of official decorum and magical scrutiny. The witness pauses, letting the weight of their testimony sink in, and you notice how even the most rigid ministry officials shift slightly in their seats, glancing at each other with faint acknowledgement of what they had perhaps previously known, but were reluctant to admit. A fringe tidbit emerges. Some believe that Umbridge enchanted certain classroom objects to report misbehavior automatically, a claim debated among historians and magical ethicists, though evidence is scarce and sometimes contradictory. You feel the thrill of uncertainty as it hangs in the air, the magical equivalent of an unresolved equation, where intent, action, and consequence collide in ways that resist definitive conclusion. The defense, sensing the threat to their narrative, attempts subtle interventions. A flick here, a whispered charm there, small protective wards designed to deflect the enchanted paper's attention or minimize the dramatic impact of the storytelling. You notice these actions only peripherally, but their presence amplifies your awareness of the trial as a living, reactive entity, one where magic and human perception are intertwined in an intricate, almost hypnotic choreography. Humor punctuates the proceedings in unexpected ways. A floating cat figurine, enchanted to sit primly on Umbridge's desk, leaps at the passing edge of a parchment that twirls too close, eliciting a ripple of stifled laughter from witnesses and audience alike, a reminder that even in solemnity, whimsy persists, subverting authority in quiet, delicate ways. Yet for every moment of levity, there is a shadow of seriousness. Each anecdote underlines the broader consequences of power wielded without empathy, the subtle forms of intimidation, the psychological toll on those under her charge, and the enduring weight of magical documentation that records not just actions, but their emotional resonance. You feel a pang of unease as you imagine the hundreds of similar incidents that may never reach the courtroom. Tales of small injustices, minor humiliations, and whimsical cruelty compounded over years, each one a ripple in the memory of the wizarding world, each one preserved magically, waiting to be acknowledged. The interplay of humor, terror, and subtle magic keeps you on edge. You feel the room vibrating softly with latent energy, the walls, enchanted portraits, and hovering parchments responding to every gesture, every word, every flicker of wand light. You notice the subtle details in the witness's demeanor, the tightening of a jaw, the barely perceptible twitch of a hand, the involuntary glance toward an enchanted quill that hovers, as if recalling past misdeeds. And you are acutely aware that even the smallest magical artifact participates in the moral and procedural theater of the trial. The story crescendos as the witness reveals how, despite the absurdity, the fear she cultivated was very real. Students hesitated to speak, teachers feared contradiction, and the invisible web of magical enforcement extended into corners of Hogwarts that seemed mundane but were subtly policed, a lattice of control woven through enchanted objects and psychological pressure alike. As the testimony winds to a close, you feel a mixture of amusement, disbelief, and solemnity. The trial is no longer just about the facts or the letter of magical law, but about the interplay between memory, magic, humor, and cruelty, and the lingering question of accountability in a world where every action can be recorded, remembered, and amplified. You glance at Umbridge. Her composure is nearly perfect, yet the faint flicker in her eyes betrays a recognition that her control, meticulously maintained for years, is now subject to scrutiny that neither charm nor intimidation can fully mitigate. The room seems to exhale collectively, and you feel yourself drawn into the interplay of narrative, magic, and moral reckoning, acutely aware that what you witness here will ripple far beyond the trial, into the quiet corners of Hogwarts and the broader wizarding community, where memory, record, and enchanted storytelling will continue to debate her legacy long after the chamber falls silent. As the prosecution rises for their final arguments, the weight of the room shifts. You can feel it in the air, a subtle thrum that reverberates through the marble floors and painted ceilings, like the ministry itself is leaning in, eager to witness the culmination of years of whispered grievances, documented cruelty, and the meticulous weaving of magical evidence. You settle deeper into your seat, aware of the hum of protective charms surrounding the judges. The faint spark of quills suspended mid-air, and the soft, expectant murmurs from portraits that line the walls, their eyes glinting with curiosity or judgment, silent witnesses to centuries of wizarding politics and misdeeds. The lead prosecutor, a wizard whose robes are austere yet dignified, begins with a tone measured and deliberate, his voice carrying effortlessly across the chamber, each word pronounced with the precision of a spell, ensuring it lodges firmly in your mind and in the minds of everyone present. They recount the cumulative evidence, revisiting enchanted memos that float lazily before the court, glowing faintly as their contents are read aloud, highlighting the meticulous cruelty that underpinned Umbridge's rule. Enforced detentions documented with magical ink that recalls not just what was written, but the distress felt by those forced to write it. Quills that tracked minor infractions automatically, whispering reminders of punishment, and enchanted classroom objects that subtly enforced compliance while eroding morale. You watch as each artifact responds, some spinning slowly in midair, others flickering with residual magic, creating a surreal, almost theatrical tableau that is part evidence, part judgment, and entirely mesmerizing. The prosecution's arguments weave a narrative that blends fact and memory, humor and horror. They recall the absurdity of pink parchment inspections, the meticulous arrangement of cat figurines, the enforcement of arbitrary rules, all set against the real psychological toll on students and staff alike, each point landing like the gentle yet inexorable strike of a gavel. You notice the slight tightening of Umbridge's posture as these details are laid bare, the careful masking of micro-expressions betraying the tension beneath her prim composure. The argument delves into historical wizarding law, citing precedents both mundane and magical, and you feel the thrill of scholarly debate alive in the air. The extent to which magical documentation carries legal weight, the ethical implications of enchanted enforcement, and the sometimes blurry line between discipline and cruelty. A subtle ripple of humor punctuates the proceedings as an enchanted quill, previously neutral, suddenly flickers and spins in a tiny dance, highlighting the ridiculous lengths to which she went to assert control, eliciting a barely suppressed smile from a few observers, including yourself, despite the severity of the content. Yet beneath the levity lies undeniable gravity. The prosecution emphasizes that the cumulative impact of her actions cannot be dismissed as eccentricity. The magical evidence demonstrates a pattern of oppressive oversight, enforced creativity suppression, and psychological manipulation, a lattice of authority that extended far beyond ordinary limits. Witness testimonies are revisited in brief vignettes, animated magically before the court, as memories of students' whispered fears, teachers' hesitant instructions, and small rebellious acts flicker like shadows on the walls. You feel each scene play out vividly, an immersive reminder of the delicate balance between magical power, morality, and accountability. The prosecutor pauses, letting the weight of the argument settle, and you notice the stillness that falls over the chamber. Quills hover motionless, enchanted papers hang suspended, and even the portraits seem to quiet, absorbing the gravity of what is being articulated. They then pivot to a subtle, almost philosophical note, discussing the interplay of whimsy and tyranny, magic and human psychology, and the enduring consequences of unchecked power, weaving in references to historical precedents in wizarding governance, the enforcement of arbitrary rules in centuries past, and the moral implications that continue to spark debate among scholars of magical jurisprudence. You realize that the trial has transcended mere judgment of an individual. It has become a meditation on authority, ethics, and the capacity for cruelty and kindness within a society shaped by extraordinary means. Small magical details underscore the points. An enchanted hourglass tilts, releasing sand in slow arcs that glow faintly, symbolizing the passage of time and the weight of accumulated actions. Miniature animated images of classroom scenes float briefly to illustrate compliance and dissent. And even the soft mew of a magically suspended cat figurine punctuates key arguments, a whimsical reminder that magic, like memory, preserves nuance. As the final moments of the prosecution's presentation unfold, you are struck by the meticulous layering of evidence, emotion, and spectacle. The courtroom itself feels alive, responsive, and acutely aware of the moral stakes, each observer caught in the interplay of narrative, magic, and human judgment. The cumulative impact of the arguments leaves you breathless. Humor and absurdity punctuate horror. Historical law and whimsical enchantment coexist. Individual memory and collective record intertwine in a tapestry that defies simple resolution. You glance at Umbridge, still seated, her hands folded tightly, eyes glinting with a mixture of defiance, anxiety, and calculation, and you understand that the verdict will reverberate far beyond the chamber. It is not merely about punishment, but about acknowledgement, remembrance, and the subtle moral reckoning that wizarding society demands when power is wielded without conscience. Even now, the enchanted quills hover silently. The parchment seems to pulse with residual magic, and the portraits lean closer, waiting, as if the entire ministry itself holds its breath for the conclusion. You realize that the trial, in all its absurdity, drama, and subtle humor, has illuminated both the ridiculous and terrifying aspects of authority, leaving a lingering question in your mind about how memory, magic, and morality intertwine, and how each act, however small or whimsical, can echo far beyond the moment, shaping perception, legacy, and the quiet whisper of justice in ways that are both profound and impossibly intricate. The verdict approaches with a tension that seems to thrum through the very walls of the ministry, a vibration you feel in your chest, as if the building itself is holding its breath, waiting for the culmination of years of careful observation, meticulous record-keeping, and yes, magical intrigue. You notice how the air seems to thicken with anticipation, heavy with the faint scent of parchment and polished stone, and the soft hum of protective wards resonates like the quiet heartbeat of the chamber itself. Enchanted quills hover poised mid-air, ink shimmering in soft blues and golds, and you can feel the collective expectation of every observer. From ministry officials with their austere robes to the portraits of past heads of magical institutions that lean forward with wide-eyed interest, whispering commentary that only a few perceptive ears might catch. Every gesture, every shuffling of feet, every flick of a sleeve carries amplified weight, and you become acutely aware that the trial has transcended simple adjudication. It has become a living, breathing moral experiment where magic, memory, and ethics intertwine with almost dizzying complexity. You watch as the lead judge adjusts their robes, wand in hand, eyes scanning the enchanted evidence and the sea of witnesses, and you sense the subtle interplay of ritual and improvisation that governs wizarding law. Certain gestures, certain incantations, certain magical validations must be observed, yet the human element, the nuance of judgment, the flicker of conscience, the weight of history, remains irreducible, unpredictable, alive. The prosecution delivers a final, quiet flourish, their words measured, deliberate, weaving together the tapestry of recollections, magical documentation, and logical deduction into a single, compelling argument that leaves little room for doubt. And yet you notice the flicker of dissent among some observers, a murmur that perhaps nuance, context, and intent should temper judgment, a subtle acknowledgement that in wizarding ethics, very few acts exist in isolation. The defense responds with a soft yet firm recitation of laws, precedents, and carefully chosen mitigating circumstances. Arguments about duty, responsibility, and the complexity of enforcing rules in a magical environment where every object and every gesture might carry consequence. You feel the tension between these two poles, collective memory and individual defense, magical law and ethical reflection, as if the entire chamber is suspended in a delicate balance, a spell hovering on the cusp of completion, waiting to be resolved. Unexpectedly, a minor witness rises, stepping forward with a trembling hand, offering a final piece of evidence, a tale that is both humorous and poignant. Enchanted classroom notes that seem to record the tiniest infraction with excruciating precision, levitating slightly, sparkling as if aware that their time in court is fleeting yet meaningful. You can't help but smile faintly at the absurdity, the image of such meticulous magic being marshaled as both witness and moral arbiter. while simultaneously feeling the oppressive weight of the consequences that these small enchantments carry, echoing through memory and moral judgment alike. The judge nods subtly, and you sense that the court recognizes not only the meticulousness of Umbridge's enforcement, but also the psychological and emotional impact it had on those under her control. Even the faintest magical artifacts, quills, parchments, enchanted inkwells, appear to shiver slightly as though acknowledging the severity of scrutiny, tiny witnesses to history being weighed and measured. You observe how the audience reacts, a whisper of relief, a stifled laugh at one particularly absurd example of magical enforcement, a quick exchange of empathetic glances between former students recounting small acts of rebellion, a subtle acknowledgement that even in suffering, human and wizarding, creativity persists. The defense attempts a final appeal, emphasizing intent, duty, and the strictures of magical law that, in some obscure historical interpretations, could absolve minor transgressions. Yet you feel the subtle tension in their argument, the recognition that magic and morality do not always align neatly, and that the cumulative impact of years of rigid enforcement and micromanaged control weighs heavily against her. You notice the subtle cues from enchanted quills as they pivot slightly toward the judge, ink swirling in gentle arcs, almost imperceptibly signaling that evidence is being acknowledged, that memory is being weighed, and that the chamber itself is a participant in the unfolding judgment. The tension is almost unbearable as silence falls. The only sounds are the gentle hum of protective wards, the soft shuffle of robes, the occasional murmur from an animated portrait, and the barely perceptible ticking of an enchanted clock somewhere high above, each tick a heartbeat marking the approach of finality. In that quiet, you become acutely aware of the delicate balance at play. The trial is a microcosm of wizarding society itself, where power, magic, ethics, and human perception collide, intersect, and sometimes clash in ways that defy easy resolution, leaving the observer suspended between amusement, horror, and a profound awareness of the subtle tyranny that can lurk behind ostensibly benign appearances. And then, finally, the judge rises, wand extended, and you feel the collective breath of the room hitch, poised on the cusp of history. The verdict will ripple outward through Hogwarts, the Ministry, and the magical world at large, a quiet but resounding acknowledgement that memory, magic, and moral reckoning converge in ways that leave no act forgotten, no consequence trivial, and no observer untouched, as the chamber waits for the words that will settle the balance between justice, whimsy, and enduring ethical reflection. The final moments of the trial arrive with a gravity that presses against your chest, a palpable weight that seems to emanate from the polished marble floors, the towering enchanted portraits, and even the hovering parchments that have borne witness to every detail of Dolores Umbridge's tenure. You feel as though the Ministry itself is holding its breath, every inch of the chamber tuned to the subtle vibrations of expectation and moral reckoning. The judge clears their throat softly, a barely audible sound that resonates like a bell through the charged atmosphere, and you notice how the assembled audience, Ministry officials, Hogwarts staff, witnesses, and spectators, sit in taut silence, each aware that the verdict will ripple far beyond this room into the corridors of Hogwarts, the offices of magical governance, and the very fabric of wizarding society. You watch as Umbridge straightens in her seat, hands folded precisely on her lap, eyes fixed forward with the meticulous control she has cultivated for decades. Yet a faint flicker in her gaze betrays a recognition of the enormity of what is unfolding, a subtle acknowledgement that even her carefully maintained armor of primness and pink can offer no shield against the confluence of evidence, memory, and moral judgment. The court leans in collectively as the judge begins to speak, voice measured, deliberate, weaving together threads of law, precedent, and moral principle, punctuated by the almost imperceptible hum of protective charms and the soft rustle of hovering parchments. The words reverberate in your chest as they outline the charges, the evidence, and the extraordinary weight of the testimonies, recalling both the humor and the terror embedded in each account, each enchanted artifact, and each memory preserved by magical means. You can almost see the quills quiver with residual energy, acknowledging the truth they have borne silently for so long. A small cat figurine, suspended by enchantment near Umbridge's desk, twitches, its glassy eyes reflecting the glow of floating parchment, a faintly humorous reminder of the whimsical, absurd aspects of her rule. And you can't help a wry smile even as the seriousness of the proceedings presses inexorably forward. The judge pauses briefly, allowing the tension to accumulate, and you feel the chamber itself vibrating subtly with anticipation, as if time has slowed, every heartbeat of every observer synchronized to the gravity of the moment. The verdict is delivered slowly, each word enunciated with care, a litany of consequence, accountability, and acknowledgement that transcends the mere letter of magical law. It is both judgment and reflection, a recognition that cruelty and whimsy, power and mismanagement leave echoes that ripple across generations. You watch as Umbridge's posture remains rigid, yet a subtle tension in her shoulders, a tiny quiver of her fingers, betrays the impact of the judgment. The magical artifacts in the room respond in kind, quills hovering lower, parchment stilling, and the air itself seeming to shift as though acknowledging the resolution of a long-standing imbalance. There is a ripple of murmured approval from the audience, tempered by the soft chuckles provoked by the occasional absurdity remembered from the trial. Levitating pink documents, dancing quills, enchanted cats performing tiny, unbidden acts. But beneath the surface, a sobering recognition settles. This trial is not just about punishment. It is about the acknowledgement of memory, the validation of those who suffered, and the subtle recalibration of authority in a world where magic can preserve both cruelty and consequence. As the courtroom begins to quiet, you reflect on the interplay of spectacle, morality, and enchantment you have witnessed, the delicate balance between humor and horror, between ritualized authority and individual experience, and between human fallibility and the relentless persistence of magical documentation. You notice the final flutter of a parchment, displaying a particularly humorous but telling anecdote, suspended in the air for just a moment longer before settling gently back onto the desk. It is a final punctuation, a reminder that even in solemnity, whimsy persists, leaving traces that human memory alone might have forgotten. The judge nods subtly to the clerks, who begin the slow, ceremonial cataloging of evidence, a process that transforms the chamber into a living archive. Each object, each artifact, and each whispered recollection now recorded in ways that ensure the legacy of this trial will endure. You feel a profound awareness of the interplay between the personal and the systemic, between magic and morality, and between human emotion and the formal structures that govern wizarding life. Every element, from levitating quills to enchanted inkwells, from whispered witness testimony to the silent gaze of ancient portraits, has contributed to a verdict that feels simultaneously inevitable and deeply resonant. And as the chamber gradually empties, leaving behind only the soft glow of residual enchantments and the gentle hum of protective wards, you find yourself reflecting on the subtle lessons embedded in every detail. That power wielded without empathy leaves ripples that endure. That memory, both human and magical, cannot be erased, and that even in a world of spells, quills, and enchanted bureaucracy, humor, absurdity, and human resilience persist, delicate yet indomitable, echoing long after the final words of judgment have been spoken. The trial concludes not with fanfare, but with a gentle, almost reverent acknowledgement of the intertwined threads of justice, memory, and magical ethics, leaving you with a lingering sense of quiet reflection, an awareness that the echoes of this day will reverberate not only through the ministry halls, but through the collective consciousness of the wizarding world, a testament to the enduring complexity of moral reckoning in a society where magic makes the invisible palpably present, and every act, no matter how small or whimsical, carries weight beyond its immediate appearance. Now, as the echoes of the trial fade, you feel the tension slowly unraveling, a gentle exhale as the ministry halls settle back into their familiar rhythm. The quills rest on their perches, ink swirling faintly in lazy arcs, while the portraits lean back into their frames, muttering soft, half-forgotten observations, as if the chamber itself is sighing in relief. The air is lighter now, scented faintly with parchment, polish, and lingering enchantment, a reminder that even in solemnity, magic carries its own quiet poetry. You trace the edges of the floating parchments with your eyes, imagining the countless stories they hold, some humorous, some tragic, all preserved meticulously in the subtle weave of ink and spellwork, waiting for the curious to notice. Outside, sunlight filters through high windows, scattering patterns across polished floors, and a breeze stirs gently, carrying with it the faint whispers of long-past lessons, minor rebellions, and quiet acts of courage. You take a deep breath, letting the soft hum of protective wards and the gentle rustle of paper soothe your mind, feeling the resonance of justice, memory, and whimsy mingling like a lullaby that vibrates subtly in your chest. Even the absurdities linger, the pink paper, the dancing quills, the animated cats, a gentle reminder that humor persists alongside solemnity, that resilience and ingenuity thrive even under rigid structures. And as you lean back, allowing your shoulders to relax, you realize that the lessons of this day, both magical and human, settle gently in your consciousness, that memory is powerful, that accountability is complex, and that even the smallest act, an enchanted quill, a whispered testimony, a quiet smile, can echo far beyond the moment it occurs. Now, as the ministry corridors quiet and the residual magic fades to a gentle glow, you feel a sense of calm and reflection, a slow, deliberate awareness that the wizarding world, with all its quirks, rules, and enchantments, continues on, intricate, alive, and quietly beautiful, leaving you with a lingering warmth and the soft comfort of understanding.